morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today, a jam-packed one, lots to get to, including a lot of political news, obviously, as we are now just 2 weeks away from Election Day. Polling guru Nate Silver still has the race at a 50-50. Silver writes for the New York Times, quote, in an election where the 7 battleground states are all polling within a percentage point or two, 50-50 is the only responsible forecast. Silver adds that his personal gut is saying Donald Trump, but he warns that his gut shouldn't be trusted more than anyone else's. Meanwhile, in a blow to Harris, the owner of the Los Angeles Times has blocked the paper from endorsing a candidate for president. That's according to Semaphore. A sharp change for the LA paper that has endorsed Democratic candidates in every presidential race since it first endorsed Obama in 2008. But Harris is getting the support of someone very important, Bill Gates. The New York Times reports that Gates recently donated about $50 million to a nonprofit organization that is supporting Harris. That donation was not meant to be made public. It was through a dark money group that doesn't have to disclose its donors, and Gates has not publicly endorsed Harris. In a statement responding to the reporting, Gates did not explicitly address the donation as an endorsement, but said, quote, this election is different.
So in other election news, former President Trump's previous resistance to early voting has seemingly been reversed. Trump is now demanding easier early voting access in North Carolina and urging voters to send their ballots early and by mail. And while Harris took the day off from campaign rallies yesterday, she deployed former President Obama and rapper Eminem to fill in. But it wasn't Eminem who was doing the rapping. Let's watch.
Now I notice my palms are sweaty, knees weak, arms are heavy, vomit on my sweater already, mom's spaghetti. I'm nervous, but on the surface I look calm and ready to drop bombs, but I keep on forgetting.
Trump responded to Obama's campaign events by calling him, quote, a jerk, and saying he looked exhausted.
I'm no fan of Barack Obama. I would not say he looked exhausted. I actually think he always brings much more energy and excitement when he speaks than basically anyone else in the Democratic Party. Democrats probably wish they could run Obama for a third term rather than Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. I mean, that's just the reality. You don't have to like him or agree with him, but he's a more effective surrogate for the Kamala campaign than almost anyone else, I would say.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think Barack Obama is the best campaigner of my lifetime, certainly in the 20 years I've been covering politics here. Now, people will agree or disagree with his policies. That's a completely different subject. But in terms of revving up a crowd, in terms of making his appeal to not only the Democratic base, but voters in, somewhat of the center ground, he's incredibly effective. The rapping thing, I'm not going to get too worked up one way or another about that. He did his thing there. It was fine. It gets headlines, it gets attention, makes things a little bit more fresh.
As a Detroit native myself, I am a fan of Eminem and Eminem music very much. Okay, I wanted to talk about this Bill Gates involvement because a lot of our viewers have interest in Bill Gates' advocacy, how he spends his money, his widespread support for public health initiatives and all that. So he did give $50 million, not chump change, to Kamala Harris through this, because we were talking about dark money, and Josh Shapiro made that complaint about Elon Musk, and it's kind of just nebulous and, ooh, dark, sounds bad, sounds, sounds evil, but Bill Gates is doing the same thing, billionaires are doing the same thing. Everybody, both sides have rich, wealthy, well-connected people who want different policies supporting their candidates, and that's how he's going to spend his money, fine, but people should be aware of it.
Yeah, people should be aware of it. I mean, I think that in an ideal world, you wouldn't have people spending $50 million or $75 million on elections. And my whole argument about that is people say, well, it's a matter of free speech, it's a matter of them making their voice heard. But if you can spend $50 million or $75 million, your voice, to my mind, gets amplified to a degree that other more regular and less affluent citizens' voices get drowned out. Whether that's Bill Gates or Elon Musk is kind of beside the point. I understand that it is within the law for him to, Gates or Musk or anyone else, to give that amount of money. My concern about it is that it simply swamps out people who don't have those resources. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it can have that effect. I'm just a little bit skeptical of, I sometimes think the importance of money for advocacy and awareness in terms of campaigning can be overstated. Not to say that money is not important for lobbying and all, business interests or labor interests or whatever it is can buy influence. Certainly that happens. All the money in the world can't help a bad candidate. The candidates get so much free media attention. Donald Trump is not turning away checks from wealthy people giving him money, but it's not like Donald Trump is not going to be able to get his message out without a check from a wealthy person. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely. And I do take your point about campaigns. We have seen over the years people spend millions, tens of millions sometimes, and lose.
It's not like the person who spends more wins every time. It's not.
No, it's not.
Close.
I mean, it's going back, I think, when Meg Whitman ran for governor of California, she spent some vast sum of money from her own personal wealth and lost quite heavily. And so this is a pattern that has been the case for a long time. I guess my argument is less about does this mean you win or lose elections, which is debatable, and more like do individuals who spend that amount of money by the nature of their wealth have outsized influence in political and civic debates generally, and I would argue that the answer to that is clearly yes.
Bill Gates has had an outsized role in a lot of our policy over the years. I quibbled with a lot of his kind of COVID guidance, although I'm for people taking the vaccines if they want to take them. I'm not for mandatory vaccination as he was. Someone who did have who has a weird level of influence on public policy, given how tied he was to Jeffrey Epstein and all of those things. That was something that horrified his wife, who's now his ex-wife, Melinda Gates.
I'm not actually expert on that, so educate me. I know there are photos of him with Epstein, but what is the connection?
They continued to have ties even after the initial arrest. And that is just why would you still be associating with this figure? That's neither here nor there from his policy agenda necessarily.
But the kind of Prince Andrew problem, basically, he stayed friends with Epstein after it was known.
Bad judgment, very bad judgment. So at top of the block, we talked about how it is a 50-50. I read Nate Silver, who I always is the person I kind of most trust on the state of the race. He had a good op-ed in the New York Times today about why he does think it's 50-50, and pointing out that people keep asking him to say, well, who do you think is going to win? And he's like, it's just a guess. It's based on nothing. If it's 50-50, that means you flip a coin.
Exactly.
Either of them could win.
Yeah.
No one can say, oh my God, I can't believe Harris won. Oh my God, I can't believe Trump won. Either of them could win. It's as close as it could possibly be. Last election was close. The election before that one was close. And this one, it might be even closer than those two.
100%. And also around this time, you get people who are trying to frankly boost their own profile or clout by making a guess and purporting to be certain, it's definitely going to be Trump, it's definitely going to be Harris, hoping that that is proven right by subsequent events and then that they will become a guru in their own mind. But I mean, it really is a guess at this point.
It's a very weird phenomenon that I've noticed more prominently recently, that Republicans, Trump, etc., want to say that they're ahead, and Democrats, Harris, etc., also want to say that Republicans are ahead. I don't know, both sides seems to prefer the narrative that Trump is winning, Republicans are winning. Democrats do that in order to, turn out, you got to donate right now, the sky is falling, apocalypse now, it's so bad, and Republicans, I guess, also like that framing for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Republicans think it sort of buoys up their supporters. And it's like, we're going to be on the winning trade and go out and do this. I do find it odd that Harris keeps talking about being the underdog because, firstly, I think that is maybe increasingly true. So, I'm not sure what it does. But also, it's not as if Democrats are, complacent anyway. A lot of Democrats who I speak to are very, very worried about the state of the race. So I'm not sure how much anxiety or how much greater anxiety she can foster there, but she's trying to anyway.
Her supporters are some of the most anxious people on the planet, I think.
Certainly. Right now they are, for sure.
Certainly agree with that. All right, coming up next, what is the state of Latino voters? What's on their minds as we head into this election? We're going to talk about that. More Rising. Stay tuned. Both Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Trump are making a last-minute push for Latino voters. Recent polling shows that Harris leads Trump among Hispanic voters in the key battleground states, but is underperforming when compared to the last three Democratic nominees for the White House.
Harris recorded an interview with Telemundo's Julio Vaquerio that is set to air tonight. In a post on X, Harris shared how her agenda, she says, will create more opportunities for Latino men. She captioned that post, quote, Donald Trump has disrespected and insulted Latino men and communities. As president, I will invest in them. Harris also writes that she will help, quote, Latino men and others start and grow small businesses with no interest loans or deferred loan repayments and fully forgivable loans of up to $20,000, among other policies.
CNN panelists tried to explain why some Latino voters may be more inclined to vote for Trump. Let's watch.
And these polls are showing that Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, is underperforming with Latino voters. And I think, kind of what we've already talked about is Latino voters are not monolithic, right? And there are plenty of Latino voters who are concerned about the border, may want a stronger border, may look at, the rhetoric that Trump has about, immigrants or people coming over and say, that's not me. I did it the right way. They didn't do it the right way. And he has an economic message and a pro-business message and an anti-socialism message that can resonate with some Latinos.
MSNBC, however, refuses to admit that Trump has gained steam among Latinos. Let's watch.
This is a person that has been no friend of the Latino community, no friend of immigrant communities, and he attacks us constantly. So as a community, we should rally behind the person that has always supported us. Donald Trump has been the most anti-Latino president, the most anti-Latino political figure of the modern era.
Ironically, Democratic Representative Robert Garcia said all that while Trump was getting a standing ovation from the Latino roundtable he hosted in Doral, Florida. Trump has said that employment, wages, and homeownership increased for Latinos during his term in office. Here's another look at the roundtable he hosted. Let's watch.
And I got a front row seat of how much you cared about the Latino community, and you delivered results, and you didn't pander to us. You gave us opportunity, and that's what we want. We want the American dream.
Yeah, it's just undeniable that Trump is doing better with certain minority communities, black voters, Latino voters, particularly male ones. Race is being depolarized in this country. We point this out all the time, that the Democratic Party's real having locked down the black vote and the minority vote in general is no longer true. Now that still Kamala Harris will likely win majorities of these voters, but just moving some of them back into the GOP column could make the difference in this election in the swing states.
Oh, it absolutely could. I mean, the number of Latino voters is increasing at an enormous rate. It's now double what it was in 2008, which is an election I can still remember vividly, and Latinos were a big part of that election. I do think that it is one of the honestly more interesting things about the way American politics is changing, how increasingly the schisms are along lines of education and income rather than race. Now, we can discuss a whole lot of reasons why that is so, and I do think that panelist who we showed there made a valid point about the fact that Latino communities are by no means monolithic, and that is true of different communities that are have heritage from different nations, be it Cuba or Mexico or Venezuela, different places. It is also true of people who are second or third generation immigrants as opposed to relatively recent immigrants. So there is a whole lot of change happening here. One caveat I would say, Robby, I don't think there's any doubt that the general trajectory is less democratic than it was. Sometimes with these polls, you look at the so-called crosstabs and the variations are vast because the sample sizes are so small. There's two polls within the past week, one saying Harris is getting 38% Latino support and one saying she's getting 58%.
Right.
So there's a lot to be skeptical about in specific polls, but yes, the trajectory is in the Republican direction.
I certainly expect her to do better than 38% with this category of voters. She gets 38% of these voters. Right. She's getting a 49 state blowout, which I don't think loss, which I don't think is going to happen. It goes to show that immigration is not necessarily the top issue of Latino voters, and there are Latino voters who are very much for reducing illegal immigration or immigration in general. I mean, sometimes they're interviewed right as they're for illegal immigrants as they're coming across the border, and they get interviewed. What do you think about illegal immigration? Like, no, shut this border down. Now that I'm through, shut this down. Democrats, I think, for a long time thought that demographics are destiny. The more people we bring in, the more heavily democratic the country is going to be. And I always point out, well, but many, especially coming from Latin America, many of these voters are more religious than more Catholic than the population of America. Some of them are fleeing dysfunctional socialist or quasi-socialist regimes, which they associate with an authoritarianism that may give them actually a distrust of the left. They're not woke. They don't want to be called Latinx. That was a made-up elite American thing. So, yeah, I think now the GOP has not, to my mind, actually expertly tried to capitalize on a natural suspicion of, I think, elite progressivism that many of in this community could have, because some of the GOP does. Some people in it do demonize or demagogue immigrants, and I think that was just short-sighted because these could be GOP voters.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that's a very valid point, that culturally and socially a lot of these groups actually have more in common with a Republican platform. And I think, I mean, I know I'm in the left seat here, but I think the Democratic Party has made a major mistake by assuming that the Latino political agenda begins and ends with immigration. And to your point, there was a poll done recently by the New York Times, of all people, saying or suggesting that more than 40% of Latinos in this country support the border wall and support the deportation of unauthorized migrants. Now, those are views that the Democratic Party would often try to cast as racist, and obviously that argument is not landing with those people. Now, I do still think that the Democratic Party also has an opportunity, if it were to reconnect more with its own working class, what was once its base, across all ethnicities on economic issues. And Harris, to be fair, is trying to do that to some extent with these proposals to make small loans more acceptable, to encourage people who are having difficulty accessing capital and things like of that nature. But it is a problem for the Democratic Party that these groups are moving in these directions. Yes, some groups are moving in the opposite direction, especially college-educated voters of all ethnicities, but it's a worrisome sign for Democrats.
I mean, and look at labor. Labor unions, the culturally becoming so much more closely linked to Trump and the Republican Party. Even though I think it's inarguable that policy-wise, the more pro-labor policies are on the Democratic side. I often disagree with many of these policies. I frankly don't want the Republican Party to adopt them, even if it would be wise politically or strategically to bring in more labor voters. But the fact is that they haven't had to really change their policies. Just the vibes, the culture of Trump is something that working class people appreciate, and they're moving in that direction without much of with certainly rhetorical differences from the GOP, but not a different agenda. It's still the Chamber of Commerce agenda.
Yeah, no, and in relation to the cultural issue, I mean, there is, for example, in Latino communities, in border states, there's quite a long tradition of Latino people working in law enforcement or having affinity or sympathy with law enforcement, and the perception, which I would argue is exaggerated, but the perception that Democrats are hostile to law enforcement has, I think, caused serious damage there. Then there's the religious issue, which you mentioned, and the fact that we alluded to Cuban Americans in South Florida in particular. I mean, that's a community that has its roots in fleeing Fidel Castro. So obviously anything that has a whiff of socialism about it is going to be anathema to those people for the most part.
Coming up next, we have Georgia on our mind. We'll tell you what we mean about that. Stay tuned for more Rising in just a minute. More bad news for Rudy Giuliani. A federal judge on Tuesday ordered him to turn over a lofty list of luxury assets and properties to two former Georgia election workers who won a $148 million defamation lawsuit against him last year. Now, for context, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss sued Giuliani after he repeatedly accused the women of committing election fraud in the 2020 election. According to the mom and daughter duo, these false claims resulted in an onslaught of threats and harassment. A jury found him guilty in December 2023.
Under the order, Giuliani has 7 days to turn over his $5 million New York City apartment, more than 24 luxury watches, and a 1980 Mercedes once owned by movie star Lauren Bacall. Giuliani requested to be able to keep sentimental items like a watch his grandfather gifted to him, but Judge Lewis Lyman rejected the ask. To date, Giuliani has not paid Freeman and Moss anything. In a statement Tuesday night, his attorney said, quote, "Stay tuned. When the judgment is reversed in the Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., these plaintiffs will be required to return all this property to Mr. Giuliani. We repeat, stay tuned." Yeah,
look, Giuliani is a charlatan, and he said things that were not true and that invited a lot of harm on these two women. I don't dispute that at all. I have long urged Donald Trump to shed all of his associations with Rudy Giuliani, some of the worst policy, political, legal impulses of the Trump administration and campaign were Giuliani's doing. All that said, man, this seems like hundreds of millions of dollars to have to give over to these people for having said things that were untrue about them, that did harm them. I fully agree that he should owe them something. This seems like a pretty vast amount of compensation.
So I'm noticing a theme in our conversations, Robby, which is often that I regard more punitive awards for defamation to be a good thing, particularly in this instance because of the vast disparity in influence or prominence of the two sides here. On one hand, you've this mother and daughter who have done something noble and honourable and necessary in this country, which is work as election workers, and they would have done it quite anonymously and quite happily. Then you have a former mayor of New York City who was also at the time a lawyer for the then president, defaming them and saying that they had been involved in things that they had not been involved in, including importing suitcases full of votes, which they weren't doing, and being up to some sort of chicanery with a USB port, when in fact it was a ginger mint candy that one was handing to the other. So he says that, he publicizes a video that says that. There is immediate threatening behavior toward both of these women. According to their testimony to the January the 6th committee, even the mother's mother, Shay Moss's grandmother, has people arriving at her door trying to barge in and make a citizen's arrest. He has caused, Giuliani has, real grave damage to these women's lives. And if he is punished ruinously for it, I think that'd be a good thing. Discourage other people doing it.
I don't know. If I get $150 million, I get cars, I get a New York apartment, I get watches, I invite you to defame me. Say all sorts of things about me you want, and I'll collect. Again, the reward seems almost worth it for the... I know what they faced was really bad, and maybe this is naive of me because you and I as public figures get tons of harassment and threatening behavior, and I guess people actually showed up to them in person, which is even beyond what probably either of us have faced. But, you know, maybe we're not civilians, we're in the fray, and we're used to that kind of thing, and I don't think ordinary people should be exposed to it. I think what he did was very bad. It's just, man, is it a ton of money.
Well, I mean, it's a ton of money for a ton of misbehavior and a ton of damage that these women incurred.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't assault them. He didn't attack them. He said things about them that were bad and wrong, but I mean, it is speech.
I think we should be tough on crime when the crime is defamation as well as everything else.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't even necessarily think defamation should be a crime or should be illegal.
Which we have a
very disagreement about. Now, it is. I accept that it is a category of speech that the Supreme Court has walled off from First Amendment protection. It used to be more important, I think, to have it be illegal when your livelihood was maybe more directly tied to your, reputation in like an 18th century sense, where, spreading rumors or gossip about the local miller could put him out of business. I don't know that that's so true anymore. There's just so many views being expressed all the time that are questionable or untrue.
Yeah, but it
seems weird to have some of them walled up as that you have to pay for.
Well, I mean, you have to pay for telling outright lies about people and their behavior. There is a difference between saying, politician X is a terrible politician and no one should ever vote for them, which of course should be protected, and saying, as Giuliani did in this case, these women conspired to steal an election when they didn't. And the damage to them is real, Robby. I think that's my argument.
I think it is too. It's just
of their right to have a peaceful life unimpeded by lunatics arriving at their house or at their grandmother's house to try to make citizens' arrests for things that they never did. It just seems ludicrous. And I just add to this one of many reasons, in my view, to dislike Giuliani. In the defamation case, he admitted through his lawyers in court that he accepted the claims were untrue. And then outside the courtroom kept reiterating the defamatory claims. This is just outrageous behaviour, and that's, I think it's appropriate that outrageous behaviour gets punished severely by the legal system.
Fair enough. Coming up next on Rising, we have an interview with journalist Paul Thacker to talk about a plan to take down Elon Musk's Twitter. Stay tuned for more Rising right after this. Are the Brits meddling in our election? That is what independent journalists Paul Thacker and Matt Taibbi revealed in their latest investigation. Kill Twitter was the headline of the to-do list of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. Now, this is an organization which is private but received some funding from the UK government. They outlined a list of accomplishments to make happen ahead of the US presidential election. Aside from getting rid of Elon Musk's X, other agenda items highlighted in the document include US policy engagement, strengthening relations with the current administration, and other officials like Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar. CCDH's founder and British political operative Morgan McSweeney is advising the Kamala Harris campaign. A think tank associated with McSweeney's group is diving headfirst into U.S. politics, teaching Harris and Tim Walz election strategy. Here to elaborate on the findings is investigative journalist Paul Thacker. Welcome to Rising.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Robby.
Yeah, great to be with you. Tell us what you found. Our viewers are somewhat familiar with the Center for Countering Digital Hate and the work they've done on what they describe as, misinformation, policing misinformation on social media. Explain how these groups are coordinating with Democratic political operatives.
So I just want to make one correction to your intro. We don't really know that they're taking money directly from the British government. And I think that's the real problem, actually, is that we don't know where their money's coming from. This is a dark money group. It has been from the very beginning when it started out in the UK. In about 2021, they jumped across the Atlantic. And I noticed them at the time because I cover corruption in science and medicine. And there was this report out called the Disinformation Dozen. And it alleged that there were 12 accounts on social media that were causing all the, what they called anti-vaccine misinformation. We know now that that report was totally false. Several of the media outlets that wrote those articles back in 2021 have corrected them in recent months. But what caught my attention was, how does this group I've never heard of jump out of the Washington Babel? I mean, you guys know how many nonprofits there are in DC. I mean, I worked in the Senate. I mean, they're everywhere. How do you get the attention of the White House? And so I've been watching them now for about the last 2 years. And what I can tell you is that I've been speaking with several of CCDH insiders over the last several months. I've been given several documents, and one was their annual meeting, their monthly planning calendar, I guess is what you could call it, updates of what was going on in the monthly meetings. And the annual priority was kill Musk's Twitter. And the second agenda was advertising focus. And this is what Center for Countering Digital Hate has been doing from the beginning. There's a misconception back in the States that this group is focused on censoring conservative. That's false. They are there to censor anyone who gets in the way of, at one point in time, the conservative arm of the Labour government, which is now in charge of back in England with Keir Starmer. And since they jumped across the pond, we don't really have a left in the United States, right? We've got like Bernie Sanders, we've got the Squad. And so they've been focused totally on attacking any kind of potential enemy or critic or competitor to the DNC. So this is involved from the beginning, mostly attacking RFK Jr. And then going after anything that stood in the way of Biden administration policies.
Paul, I read through the piece this morning, and it's a fascinating long piece. Certainly encourage people to read it. But I just want to press a bit of a point. I mean, do you think it's really fair to say that this group is meddling in an American election? I understand that the founder is this sort of figurehead or Svengali within the British Labour Party. He's associated with this group, and he, through a separate but related think tank, is advising Kamala Harris. But do you think there's really that's enough to say there's a through line between this group's approach and the actual conduct of the American election?
Well, the chairman of the board of Center for Countering Digital Hate is a guy named Simon Clark. He was originally at the Center for American Progress, which, as you know, ran the Hillary Clinton campaign back in 2016. He's on a bunch of different groups that helped to push Biden's win in 2020. So I don't know. I mean, ask Simon Clark, I guess. Ask him, like, what's his agenda?
But I
right?
guess,
I mean,
I guess, no, sorry to cut across you. I mean, I guess my point is, like, we know and remember that back in, I guess, her primary campaign, Kamala Harris wanted or suggested that Donald Trump's account should be suspended from what was then Twitter. So, I mean, to me, it's not that surprising that she would have a more, whatever word you want to use, censorious attitude to social media anyway, regardless of what one thinks of the tactics of this particular group, no?
Right, but that's not the issue is what she wants. The issue is, why is this group here? I mean, the chair of the board of the Center for Countering Digital Hate is a Democratic Party political operative, full stop, not up for discussion. So what is their job? I mean, it's very obvious what his job is to do. His job is to, be a surrogate for the Democratic Party, and that's what this group is doing. It's not that hard to understand.
Yeah, I found it really revealing that on their to-do list, the action item was so blatant: kill Musk's Twitter. Usually these kinds of organizations, I mean, again, they say that the Center for Countering Digital Hate, they're using now kill, the verb kill. I don't mind people using colorful or inflammatory language, but they're usually, these groups describe what they're doing as, we would like to reduce the spread of misinformation. We would like to reduce the spread of hateful language or racism on the platform. But here, behind closed doors, what they're saying is, no, we want to destroy this entire platform.
Right. There's not just that, but like the other sort of thing that you're hitting on is we hear it being called moderation. One of the action items, which you didn't report on because there's so much stuff in that one document, was to deplatform Libs of TikTok, which, as you know, Robby, that the group that Chaya runs, which is very much understood as a conservative sort of messaging machine. And what they wanted to do was deplatform, not to moderate, right? This idea of moderation is total nonsense. It's censorship. In a recent court case that Nina Jankowicz brought against Fox News, when the judge ruled, he actually went and read from the dictionary and said, here's what censorship is. So there's been this game of trying to pretend this is not censorship, that it's something else. You give it some other name, that this group is, it's not a political program. It's actually like a do-gooder nonprofit. Look, I don't mind if there's a do-gooder nonprofit out there that's trying to do this, or if there's a political campaign out trying to do this. But let's label these things as they are, right? I mean, there's a group that's run by the former Trump guy. I think it's called American First Legal. Yeah, I think it's Stephen Miller's his name. No one looks at that guy as a do-gooder nonprofit. They understand that he's an arm of, the Trump agenda, and he's labeled as such. What the media has not done is label CCDH for who they are, which is a political campaign started by labor and passed off to the Democrats.
Yeah, I think that double standard is very key because, as you said, yes, there are partisan actors on the Republican side. They're carefully reported on. Their activities are described in major mainstream media. But then these other groups that are enacting a partisan Democratic agenda or are working, to constrain the conversation on social media are described as fact-checking organizations or nonprofit journalistic projects, that sort of thing. And what we have seen in the past is a tremendous amount of, thanks to reporting by you and others, the tremendous amount of coordination by agents within our own federal government and these such groups. And again, I want to be careful. Specifically, can't remember what the level of engagement was between them and this group. I remember the Global Disinformation Index, which did receive, which is a separate group that did receive some State Department funding and was also involved in these kinds of things. Do we know about what levels of conversations that might have been had with government agents on this topic?
Oh, they've been in discussion. So just to let you know, again, the conservative group, American First Legal, I'm labeling them effectively, correct, Robby? Robby is a conservative writer for National Review. Everyone knows that. He will be labeled as such. He was ever to appear in the New York Times.
Yeah.
We don't label these things on the Democratic Party side as such.
Yeah.
Right? Meanwhile, American First Legal released documents showing them meeting with multiple members of the Department of Homeland Security. I think this came out like within the last year. And I've known for a long time what Imran Ahmed's background is. He was a staffer for a member of parliament from the conservative arm of Labor. His head of research, Callum Hood, also worked for a conservative member of parliament, who then went on and worked directly with Boris Johnson. And I don't mind if these things happen, but we need to label them as such and explain to people what's going on and not create this Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is now being quoted all over the media as a fact-checking organization, as a group looking to fix hate. This is a group that has gone after, that has become an expert in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-vax information, disinformation, misinformation, election integrity. And in every situation, the issues they choose to emphasize in Trump and the particular spin they tend to put on it just happens to coincide and quite frankly, nuzzles up very nicely with the Democratic Party right now.
Yeah.
Let's just call it what it is.
Paul Thacker, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Ooh, Democrats are saying the quiet part out loud. President Joe Biden called to lock up former President Donald Trump during a New Hampshire campaign event on Tuesday.
I know this sounds bizarre. It sounds like if I said this 5 years ago, you'd lock me up. We got to lock him up.
But the president appeared to quickly catch himself and change course.
I know this sounds bizarre. It sounds like if I said this 5 years ago, you'd lock me up. We got to lock him up. Politically lock him up.
We've all heard this tune before, like back in 2016 when "lock her up" was a regular chant from Donald Trump and his supporters toward Hillary Clinton's campaign. Trump also called specifically for Clinton to go to prison, saying in a June 2016 speech, quote, "Hillary Clinton has to go to jail."
Yeah, I point this out all the time. The only person the only figure who is facing jail time for his political activities is Donald Trump himself. So it actually would not be weird if Joe Biden does think Donald Trump should be locked up. The Democratic levers of justice are squeaking toward that hopeful outcome. That is what the Democratic Party wants. So it's a desire to lock him up.
But first of all, I think I would argue against the idea that it is political activities. It's a rather expansive definition of political activities to suggest that Donald Trump has been charged with crimes in relation to that. He's been charged with trying to overturn the results of a legitimate election. Now, in the case of Biden, I think that particular clip is a pretty good reason why the Harris campaign wouldn't necessarily want Biden on the campaign trail all that much in the next 2 weeks. He does have this propensity to say things that just fuel conservative anger and Republican enthusiasm, therefore.
It's not even conservative anger, it's just, I guess I'm angry that he's not capable of being president and still serving as president?
They disagree. The argument of lock him up feeds into the Republican and particularly the MAGA argument that about a politicized justice system and all of that. Look, my view of the whole Trump thing is I think he should be charged for things that a regular citizen would be charged for, and he shouldn't when charges would probably not be pressed against a regular citizen. That puts me in the odd position that the one thing he's been convicted of is the one case that I thought was not a particularly strong case. And the things that I do think were very strong cases, particularly in relation to classified information at Mar-a-Lago and alleged obstruction around that, seem highly unlikely to come to trial.
The classified documents one is basically a slam dunk because it's obvious that he did do it and he admits to doing it. I also don't know how serious it actually is because political figures retaining classified documents is very common. Now, he went above and beyond and kept them where the rest of them gave them back. I just don't know how important that is. On the election stuff, I think the Georgia indictment has presented some impressive technical details that will tend to get him in trouble in terms of actually criminal, not just speech, but activity. Because I do, you and I come back to this a lot. I draw a distinction between speech and activity. In the Georgia case, there's more evidence of meetings, fake meetings being held or put together. The Jack Smith indictment does involve a lot of conduct that I think was bad from Trump. But if you read the indictment, it's a lot of he tweeted, he said, and that starts to get tricky for me, and very, again, very related to his January 6th, a day of activity that was bad, and if you say is disqualifying to be president, fine, and which was adjudicated through the process of impeachment and removal, where he survived. You can be sad about that. Is it criminal? I don't think he incited a riot. I think it's fine to say he's morally responsible for it, and he shouldn't have, his actions contributed to it, and he shouldn't be president on that basis. I have a really hard time saying that it rose to the level of a criminal conspiracy.
So on the Jack Smith indictment, I think that Smith does lay out a pretty convincing argument as to how Trump did try to overturn the election. Now, as somebody who I'm unlikely to be chosen for the jury pool, I think I would almost certainly convict him on those charges. But the point is that Trump, in that case, can make the argument that he genuinely thought the election was in some way dodgy and therefore was trying to pursue a course that he thought was right. I don't believe that, and I don't actually think he genuinely thought that, but he can make that argument. In Mar-a-Lago, it's less, in fact, the classified documents themselves that bother me or the most incriminating thing. It's that if the conduct alleged in the indictment there actually happened, it's just textbook obstruction of justice. It's someone being subpoenaed for documents and conspiring to hide them. Now, of course, if it ever did come to trial, Trump would have his day in court. He's entitled to the presumption of innocence. He's entitled to the opportunity to try to rebut that allegation. But if you or I, and this is where I come back to my original point, if you or I were subpoenaed for documents and conspired with other people to hide them, we'd be going to jail in all probability.
Yeah, there's a lot of over-classification of documents that also takes place. He should have just given them back. Now, he might claim, or some of his defenders have claimed in that case, he thought it was important to keep those documents because they represented a dispute between him and some military authorities, right, for a plan to attack North Korea, and they were trying to say that was his plan, and he was trying to say, well, no, that was their plan, and so that's why so there might have been some reason for him to have the documents, but of course, if the federal government says you got to give him back, you got to give him back.
Yeah, which is the point. That's why he seems blatantly, well, the evidence of obstruction of justice seems damning, and that's a serious offence and carries a significant sentence of either 10 or 20 years, I believe.
More rising still to come. Please stay tuned for more right after this.
Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, John Kelly, is making headlines for calling his former boss a fascist and suggesting that he praised Adolf Hitler. Let's watch.
But certainly, the former president is in the far-right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
Reacting on X, former Trump White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews tweeted, quote, "John Kelly, Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, was handpicked for the role. As a decorated retired general and Gold Star father, he is a good, honourable man. If he says Trump praised Hitler, met the definition of a fascist, and would govern like a dictator if allowed, we should believe him." MSNBC's Morning Joe also expressed outrage over the things outlined by Kelly. Let's take a look.
So this is more than an election to see who the next president is. This is an election to determine the future fate of what form of government we have and if Madisonian democracy survives.
Speaking of Morning Joe, the former acting director of U.S. National Intelligence, Richard Grenell, tweeted this morning, quote, "Comcast must step in and stop the dangerous rhetoric from Morning Joe." The New York Times, Mike, and every guest are saying that Donald Trump will use the military against his political opponents and saying he is absolutely Hitler. This is calling for someone to kill him. It's 2 weeks before an election, and the repeated emotional appeal that Trump must be stopped is calling for violence. So this is big news this morning. These comments by John Kelly, who was former White House chief of staff, saying that now the question many conservatives are going to be having is John Kelly has not liked Trump for a very, very, very long time. So why is he suddenly speaking up and recalling these instances of Donald Trump praising Hitler in a very specific context, by the way, saying that, according to John Kelly, that Trump admired the loyalty of the generals that the generals of Hitler's had to him, which of course is actually not true. Hitler's generals tried to kill him multiple times. You want some other... It's not a great metaphor for unquestionable loyalty.
No, it's not. But I mean, I think to answer the question about John Kelly, if John Kelly believes that Donald Trump is a fascist, then presumably he thinks he needs to do all he can to stop Donald Trump being elected for a second term as President of the United States. Now, you're right that Kelly has disliked Trump for a long time, but I got from your comment the implication that he's sort of motivated by personal animus, whereas in fact maybe he just dislikes Trump because he thinks he's a fascist, right? Because he thinks he doesn't have respect for the guardrails of civil society, because he will, in Kelly's judgment, be willing to use the military against his enemies and so on and so forth. So I think that's the reason that John Kelly is making this argument. And he did say, to be fair, that he actually agrees with some of Trump's policies, or some of Trump's policy positions at least. He just thinks he's literally too dangerous a person to have wielding the levers of power from the Oval Office.
Yeah, has that become a boy who cries wolf problem at some point? I agree that the things Trump said, including in the last week, are not good, are unwise, are actually spook people from voting for him who aren't already totally on board. But, he was the president for 4 years, setting aside the very, very, very bad and foolish things he did with respect to the election. It was basically pretty standard Republican governance. And so what people on the conservative side wonder is it really that, apart from some departures on foreign policy, which is that really the thing that bothers generals type mindset, military people like John Kelly, that Trump didn't always, although he ended up listening to them a lot of the time, probably more times than I was comfortable, is that really their criticism of him? Is it fascist not to listen to your generals?
But I don't know it's accurate really, Robby, with all due respect, to say that Trump's first term was broadly, with the exception of January 6th, orthodox Republican governance, because you can make that argument for sure on things like taxation, for example. But can you really make that argument about things like the way he would brand the media enemies of the people, the way he would speak profanely, apparently, about other countries outside the United States, the idea of, doing diplomacy with Little Rocket Man, who he was going to obliterate and then was his best friend and they'd fallen in love through their letters. Like, these are not... I
agree with you, but I still just put that in the bucket of that's the things he said. The things he says are well outside the normal boundaries of American politics. I 100% agree with you. That's what a lot of people like about him. That's what maybe even more people don't like about him. And I think it's a liability for sure. I criticize it all the time. But it's not. But I do even separate that from the actual governing policy. Maybe in some ways it's hard to do that on the foreign policy, right? If he's having a combative relationship with world leaders. But Joe Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator, had a faux pas about how he described foreign world leaders. Trump says some nasty things about some world leaders, but so do other Republicans who are more hawkish, and so do Democrats.
Yeah, I just think that whether one has some admiration for Trump's policies or not, it seems to me just impossible to argue against the fact that he has coarsened American political culture to a vast degree by the personal invective, by the hyperbole and frequently outright lies. And of course, we kind of skipped through January the 6th, but January the 6th to me seems the most damning indictment of him by a long, long way. And in relation to the debates that are around this election, we have discussed, and perhaps we'll discuss again today, things that Kamala Harris has missteps on or says things that are not particularly wise to say at various times. But that just seems to suggest or to imply, as political debates sometimes do, that there's a symmetry between Harris giving an awkward answer in an interview and Trump saying he would potentially sort of set the military on his enemies. Those two things are not the same thing.
I also, of course, don't agree with Rick Grinnell that Comcast should be deplatforming people who do heated criticism of Donald Trump. That seems like obviously a bad idea. In fact, I've criticized Democrats when they've called on the same media companies to deplatform Fox News or Newsmax or Donald Trump himself or whatever. So that seems like doing the exact same thing. No, you should be free to call Trump a fascist or the second coming of Hitler if you think that's persuasive. Go forth, that's your right. I don't think that is necessarily, that's inviting violence against him, although it is true that Donald Trump has faced now repeated attempted assassinations, including one that actually did wound him and killed someone else.
Sure.
I'm not someone who lazily blames other people's political rhetoric for these kinds of things, although I will say that when the shoe was on the other foot, in many cases, Democrats absolutely did this, and then Republicans do it when it's on their side, and I think we obviously need space to criticize our political leaders, our candidates for the presidency, so I don't appreciate that kind of thing, but it happens on both sides a lot.
It does. I mean, I think I believe more than you that there is a linkage between rhetoric and violence, but I don't think it is a very simple or straightforward cause and effect. And I think the rhetoric and, for that matter, the violence both emerge out of an exceptionally polarized politics that we have right now, where there isn't really a middle ground often. And frankly, there are supporters of both sides who sort of speak in dehumanizing terms about their opponents, or they assume that having a different political belief renders the other person a bad person. And I think once you do that and you go down that road, then you open the door to all sorts of unpleasant things.
Well, coming up next on Rising, we're going to be taking a look at the Arab American vote, which unsurprisingly Kamala Harris is having some trouble nailing down. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with how Biden has handled the issues of Israel. Stay tuned, more Rising right after this. Now a brief clarification to a story we discussed on yesterday's program. Now, in our conversation about the new FTC rules banning fake reviews, we talked about how social media platforms handle the problem of those fake reviews. In doing so, we did inadvertently mischaracterize how Yelp in particular deals with consumer reviews. According to a Yelp spokesperson, quote, "There has never been any amount of money a business can pay Yelp to alter the reviews or the ratings. Yelp uses an automated recommendation software that applies the same objective rules to every business and does not take a business's advertising status into account. We, of course, at Rising regret this error." Now on to the news. Lara Trump, the co-chair of the Republican National Committee and wife to Donald Trump's son Eric, got into it with the Breakfast Club host Charlamagne Tha God on Tuesday. Let's watch that.
Donald Trump really was very beneficial to the Black community when he was in the White House. I will say I've never seen this man say a racist thing. I think the attacks are fairly... Why is that funny, Charlamagne?
I'm just like, it's hysterical. But I mean,
but no, Charlamagne,
because people act like there's no such thing as Google or we don't have TV.
This is a man who, as I said in the beginning, was beloved by so many people in this country, and he was friends with everybody.
A lot of celebrities.
Jesse Jackson, by the way,
please
his Rainbow
don't do
Coalition.
That. He had black friends. That's not going to work.
No. He let them stay rent free in one of his buildings. The Rainbow Coalition, because he felt like at the time that was a very important thing.
Kudos to her for venturing into not particularly friendly territory. But Charlamagne Tha God is an independent thinker who I often believe it's worth listening to. We play a lot of his clips on the show. If he's going to say Donald Trump is racist or racist toward black people in particular, that's a claim you should be allowed to make. You should also cite evidence for it. I don't know if they got into a specific argument or examples. Most commonly, I think when this charge is made, the examples brought forth have to do with how black employees were treated in his businesses, for which there's adversarial and supportive reporting saying that's true, saying it's not true. I don't know what else they're pointing to. Or maybe his specific behavior toward Kamala Harris or that she's not black or what. I don't know why he got into that, but...
I mean, I do think that there are things that Trump has either said or done that are racist, frankly. Going back, now this goes back to the 70s and then people roll their eyes because it goes back so far, but he and his father settled a case in the 70s from the Department of Justice, which was about discrimination against black tenants. Their applications were marked with the letter C for coloured. That case, as I say, was ultimately settled. Then you go to the Obama birtherism thing, which I think was implicitly and clearly racist. Then we can have the whole debate about Charlottesville again. And then I think we can say this, I don't think we have have to bleep it out. The fact that he was reported to refer to shithole countries, which were all black majority nations during the time he was president. You'd put those together, and I don't think it is an illegitimate charge to make at all. Now, there's an argument to be made that the charge gets thrown against him for things that are disputable. It's happening today because he referred to Kamala Harris yesterday as lazy, and certainly the Washington Post, I think, has a thing about how this is pushing forth a racist trope against Harris.
Oh yes, I pulled this up. Trump attacks Harris with racist stereotype, eyes extreme power as president. The racist stereotype is that she's lazy. I mean, what are we allowed? Am I allowed to say that she's lazy because I don't think she's done enough media interviews and that she got out of actually even having to run in a primary or do any debates the way every other candidate has to do? What are we allowed to say?
No, I do think that point is fair. I think that Trump's history in the way that I just laid out is racist. I also think that the charge is made against him too frequently. And the lazy thing, of course, is filtered through the lens of all the previous comments. So if a Democratic strategist or someone supportive of Harris came out panicked about her campaign strategy and said, well, it's lazy not to be doing 2 campaign rallies, that person almost certainly would not be charged with being racist or using racist tropes by the Washington Post, the New York Times, or whomever. But, I mean, I understand why Charlamagne laughed when Lara Trump said that. That's my point.
I mean, the one, just to push back on what you said, the incident, or the anecdote or example you gave that I think will inspire the most pushback, maybe from some people watching this, is the Charlottesville one, where there was even a kind of debunking that the fact checkers, I can't remember if it's Pointer or it's I think it's Snopes, pointed out that it's often just casually asserted that he was saying there were many fine people, including among the tiki torch wielding people at the statue, when really what he was saying is that there are people who are not racist who nevertheless think taking down statues is not a good thing to do, or is erasing our past, or that there's no limiting principle in that it's not going to stop with Robert E. Lee, it's Thomas Jefferson, it's Washington, it's everyone, and that's not a good thing. And I agree with that.
There's certainly a case for parsing those remarks, and I think they can be interpreted either way, actually. But I think that the problem in Charlottesville was he was far, far too equivocal about condemning people who were on the extreme right, who were engaging in blatantly intimidatory far-right behavior, marching with torches and so forth, and his overall thrust was to minimize the dangers of that.
I don't know if I agree with that on the Charlottesville comments. I do think later when he was asked about the Proud Boys at that debate, the stand back and stand by or whatever it was, that could have been a little stronger. How about stand down? How about no more standing? Sit.
Right, exactly. I mean,
on that case, I mean, I don't. I don't mean to sound like a Trump apologist today. I'm not a supporter of his. I won't be voting for him. But to give voice to people who are supporting of him, I think some of this is not really is just, well, in these cases he's reticent to call out people who support him. He's not someone to do the whole whoever David Duke is supporting. There's been Republicans in the past. I actually think it's Jill Stein this time around for the Israel policy. And then what you often have is the figure who gets the endorsement from the racist Nazi person says, I unequivocally reject this person's support. Donald Trump is not someone to reject support from people who are supportive of him. Maybe it'd be a wise thing to do. I don't know that reflects him being a racist, but just someone who is utterly, ruthlessly, politically calculating and will not denounce people who are pro him, even if he ought to, like Laura Loomer or those kinds of gadfly people who get him in trouble, or Rudy Giuliani for a long phase. I
mean, we've been through this on the other side, because when Obama first ran, firstly there was the whole Jeremiah Wright controversy, and Obama did ultimately disown him. But I am nearly sure, and people can check this on Google if because I'm going from memory, didn't Farrakhan endorse Obama in 2008? I believe. Louis Farrakhan endorsed Obama, I think.
Yes.
And so it became this whole thing about, are you going to disclaim this and all of that. I think that Obama did appropriately distance himself from figures like that. And talking of Obama and talking of the charge of Trump racism, the birtherism thing, I mean, I understand that you're not here to defend Trump, to your credit, but surely the birtherism thing was just blatantly racist.
What can I say? It was bad. And so is, I don't know why fighting about Kamala Harris, about when she started referring to herself as black over whatever her other ethnicity background, Indian background, it doesn't, who cares, it doesn't matter. And
why are you reluctant to use the word racist about the birtherism thing?
I mean, it's not inherently racist to say that you don't, I mean, he could have made this claim about a white person being born somewhere where there was dispute over whether John McCain was born in, well, yes, but just because you've said something nasty or unfair or bad against someone who is black doesn't necessarily mean you're racist. I mean, I would say this about a lot of police brutality cases, like George Floyd case. Absolutely wrong and appalling what was done to him. The police officer's actions were wrong, and I believe contributed to his death, the officer Derek Chauvin. I think it was right to charge him. It touched off an entire racial reckoning in this country, even though there's not a shred of evidence that it actually had to do with race. No one has presented evidence that this police officer was racist or that he was targeted because he was black. Well, that doesn't make it any worse or better.
I mean, did that police officer murder any white people that we're aware of?
He's murdered one person, and that person happened to be black.
But you don't think there's any
But if the person... No, what if George Floyd was white and the same thing happened? This thing does happen to white people. There is a there's a disparity to some degree, although it is in cases exaggerated. If you look at the actual data, it's not that stark. To make the accusation of racism, I need to hear not just disparaging of an individual, but some pattern of disparaging people, an entire race of people because they're black.
But in the case of policing, there's a pattern of police violence against black people. Not to say that police violence against white people is zero, but that the greater preponderance of police violence is against black people.
That's because black people are more likely to be low income, and low income people live in areas where there's more criminal activity, and there's more policing because there's more criminal activity. And I'm not pretending there is no racism. There's certainly a greater aggression. And then there are policies like stop and frisk that went on in New York that was racist on its face because it was stopping people even when there was no underlying suspicion, and it was clearly disproportionately stopping black people, even, again, with no underlying reason to do so. So that, I would say, was a racist policy. But just, there are race-based disparities in our country that that I would say do not have to do with like immutable actual differences or characteristics of the races, but have to do with, are more correlated with poverty and those things, which because of historical inequities involve more minority people.
Yeah, I mean, just to circle back to the Obama thing, I mean, I just think that you can't, to suggest that Donald Trump implied or in some instances accused Obama of having been born elsewhere, and that it was just happenstance that Obama was vying to be the first black president, or maybe had become the first black president by that point, to suggest that there's no correlation between those two facts.
I mean, I'm not going to like jump out of my seat to fight you on that. No, that was not a racist remark. It's a bad remark. He should not have done it. It initially made most people in the Republican Party turn against him. It was not treated very positively even by conservative people until Donald Trump won his war over the Republican Party, and now it's his, and now people don't like to criticize him if you're a conservative. More to come still on Rising today. We're going to be talking about Joe Rogan is going to sit down with Donald Trump. Maybe he'll ask him about some of these things. We'll get into it. More Rising right after this. It's happening. Donald Trump will sit down with none other than Joe Rogan on Friday. Trump has made the calculated gamble that this one conversation is worth canceling all other events that day, and he's probably right. But surprise, surprise, the liberal magazine, The New Republic, is slamming this much-anticipated sit-down between the former president and the host of the biggest podcast in the world. They published a headline that calls Rogan, quote, one of the worst people ever in history. Now, Rogan is laughing this off. He actually posted that article as a badge of honor to his 500 million followers on X. It's surely to Trump's benefit to do this. He's made a concerted effort to lock in young male voters who disproportionately listen to podcasts, including Joe Rogan's. In the past few months, Trump has sat down with podcasters like Lex Fridman, Theo Von, wrestler Mark Calloway, aka The Undertaker, to name just a few.
And X is going wild over this forthcoming interview. Jordan Peterson posted, quote, "Hey Joe, I hear you got Trump. Congrats, grill him good and see what's there." Journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote, quote, "Liberals think Dick and Liz Cheney, Bill Kristol and George W. Bush are honourable and moral patriots, while Joe Rogan is, quote, one of the worst people ever, unquote. Due, of course, to all the wars, torture programs, illegal domestic spying, kidnapping, coups and mass murder Rogan implemented." Another user posted, quote, "Joe Rogan finally interviewing Trump will give him an amazing boost right before the election. These long-form interviews are where Trump shines." And former presidential candidate Andrew Yang wrote, quote, "So now that Trump is going on Rogan, I think Kamala Harris should publicly say she'll go on too. It's the biggest audience one can get."
I hope Kamala Harris does go on Joe Rogan. I hope she asked to do so, and that he does this. If he's going to have one on, he should have the other. I mean, it's his show. He can do whatever he wants.
Right.
Previously, he said he's not wanted to interview Donald Trump because he didn't want to give the appearance of helping out Trump at all. That's a direct quote from him. But of course, he's had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on a number of times. He's had Elon Musk on. He is, increasingly associated with the right, even though the only endorsement that I can remember him making was of Bernie Sanders in the 2020 campaign. And that was almost seen by something, Ryan Grimm, who I used to host this show with, pointed this out at the time. That was almost seen by, panicky liberal elite media Democrats as a negative thing. Oh no, Joe Rogan is on Bernie's side. That's a tisk tisk. This is the biggest podcast audience in the world. And no liberal, Kamala Harris is, again, touting, the comparison I think is very fair, the endorsement and support of the Cheney family, who liberals, up until 5 seconds ago, considered to be Darth Vader incarnate.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Cheney thing I would not defend. I wouldn't defend it morally, and I wouldn't defend it politically either. Taking Liz Cheney to Michigan, of all places, your home state,
my home state,
seems ill-advised.
She's not welcome there.
For a Democratic nominee who's already facing some of the difficulties that we've spoken about already. But look, the Joe Rogan thing, excuse me, I think it is good that there are long-form interviews at all. One of the advantages of podcasting has been the capacity to have these very long interviews. Frankly, and no disrespect to Joe Rogan, they're a bit too long for me to tune into, but I see the clips come up on social media and elsewhere. I have never fully understood exactly what the Liberal complaint against Joe Rogan is. I think he may have... Did he use the N-word at some point in the past?
No, they don't like him for COVID stuff.
Okay.
He put forth heretical, contrarian attitudes relating to vaccine and vaccine mandates, and there was it's the ivermectin thing. He said that he took ivermectin to deal with COVID, and liberals freaked out. They called for Spotify to deplatform him. In 3 hours of talking, he doesn't pretend to be an expert on anything. He does 3 hours of talking with various people. Sometimes he challenges the guests. He's had on pro-Israel guests that he actually has challenged very much. Sometimes he doesn't challenge them. Sometimes he agrees. Sometimes he doesn't. I think some of the things said on the show are wrong. I think some are right, just like other shows. But liberals treated it like it was, again, it's a dangerous platform for misinformation type thinking that is a little bit myopic.
Well, and presumably they will pick up on that particular baton when Trump goes on, because Trump has obviously a propensity to say hyperbolic things, to say the least.
They're going to say this is dangerous, that this is dangerous for the country, that he's being allowed to have this platform, and it needs to be shut down. I absolutely predict that that's what we're going to hear all of next week.
I do think, generally speaking, it is good to have people, whether it be Joe Rogan or other people, in that podcast space. You and I have disagreements about some things, but also I think a degree of skepticism about the sort of the cable news ecosystem and people preaching to the converted or staying within very, very orthodox trenches in who they have on, what they say, what is permitted to be said. So if people like Joe Rogan give a wider number of people the capacity to be heard, so long as it is not defamatory, of course, I don't really have an objection to that. And I think it is plainly, in Rogan's case, finding a huge audience. But even among podcasters who are less well known than him, there are obviously a lot of people who are getting a big audience from people who are dissatisfied with the existing media choices.
I mean, this show, Rising, exploded in the first place because the previous hosts before me, Crystal Ball and Sagar Enjeti, they went on Joe Rogan, and he was a fan of theirs. He was a fan of Rising at the time. Maybe he still catches some episodes of ours now, every now and then. Yeah. And the channel grew tremendously just because of that showcase. It really goes to show you there's nothing else like it on the internet or anywhere. The massive audience he has of people, right, who aren't just watching cable news all day or not plugged into who primarily get their political related news from listening to this. I know, friends, family members, etc. like this who aren't so plugged into, the campaign news, CNN, Fox, whatever, but they love listening to Joe Rogan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that Kamala Harris should go on. I think
she should.
Not least because she is having real difficulties with the demographic to whom he most appeals, but also just more broadly, a long-form interview where people are not, I think, expecting every single word you say to be perfect or honed or scripted, but you're having a extended conversation. I think that could help with issues of authenticity and so forth.
An environment where every word is not expected to be polished and scripted would be playing to her advantages in some way, or lack thereof.
But that's fine. I mean, if you fluff a sentence or you mess up or whatever, it's okay. Within the context of 3 hours, nobody's word perfect for that length of time. Not even you and me, Robby.
That's right. Do it, Joe. Do it, Kamala. We'd like to see that conversation take place. That does it for our conversation today on Rising. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. For those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available wherever you can get your podcast fix. Keep writing to me. I enjoy your comments, your emails, your messages. Love feedback on the show. We'll be back here tomorrow. See you then.